there in the first place. Awilda was given full custody of Elisa in September 1994. As soon as that happened, she took her out of the private school and enrolled her in public school. And from the very beginning, everyone noticed that she was withdrawn, emotionally disturbed, she wouldn't communicate, and she peed herself frequently. They also noticed she was covered in bruises, she didn't walk right, and had begun tearing out her hair. On March 14th, 1995, an anonymous letter was sent to the Manhattan Child Welfare Authorities. They said that Awilda had cut off much of Elisa's hair and had begun locking her in a dark room. 6 days after that, Elisa was admitted to the hospital with a fractured shoulder. It had happened 3 days before, and nothing had been done about it. The abuse kept being mentioned and reported to the Manhattan Child Welfare Authorities, and it was the school. The school kept reporting it. And they replied that their concerns were not reportable because there was a lack of direct evidence, and the reports were rejected. Awilda had started using crack again, and she took her out of school completely in the spring of 1995 and never put her back in school. So, once she was taken out of school, Elisa was locked in her bedroom. She wasn't able to talk to any of her siblings. At this point, there were 5 other children. But Elisa was getting the brunt of the abuse, as so often happens in multi-child homes. Where there's abuse, it's usually focused on one child, but everyone will encounter some form of abuse usually, but there's one child that's the lightning rod for the most of it. She was also denied access to the bathroom, so she had to use the bathroom in her room. Neighbors could hear her being beaten, and they did report it to the cops that they heard her yelling, "Mommy, Mommy, please stop, no more, I'm sorry." But no action was taken. And a lot of neighbors knew what was going on and never reported it. So these were not the only things that happened to Elisa. A lot of these were witnessed by her siblings. She was repeatedly punched and kicked. She was forced to eat her own feces. She was forced to drink water with ammonia in it. Her mother would mop the floor with her hair. She would burn her head, face, and body. And she sexually violated her vaginally and anally with a hairbrush or toothbrush. Awilda's partner, Carlos Lopez, also a drug user, is known to have repeatedly physically abused and neglected her. But he also abused and neglected her 2 older siblings because none of the 3 were his children. On November 15th, Carlos Lopez was put in jail because he violated his parole. A week later, Awilda phoned one of her sisters, Mercy, to report that Elisa was, quote-unquote, like retarded on the bed. She had fluid leaking from her nose and mouth, and that was later determined to be brain fluid. In addition, Lopez informed her sister that Elisa would not eat or drink. When her sister insisted Awilda take her to the hospital, she said she would think about it after she had finished cleaning the dishes. The following morning, she called a neighbor and had the neighbor come over to view Elisa's lifeless body. The neighbor realized that she was dead and told Awilda to call the police. And in response, the neighbor immediately called police and an ambulance, and Awilda threatened to commit suicide. While she was in custody, she confessed to having thrown Elisa headfirst into a concrete wall 2 days prior, and mentioned that Elisa neither talked nor walked after that incident. At autopsy, it was revealed that she had broken fingers, one of which was protruding through the skin, damage to her internal organs, deep welts and burns across her head, face, and body, and her genitalia and rectum showed evidence of trauma, including tearing, and it was proven that the injuries had been sustained over a prolonged period of time. So at her funeral, Reverend Gianni Agostinelli mentioned to the 300 mourners in attendance that Elisa had been murdered not only by her own mother, but by the quote-unquote silence of many, by the neglect of child welfare institutions and the moral mediocrity that has intoxicated our neighborhoods. Prince Michael of Greece was at her funeral, along with many members of the public and relatives, neighbors, politicians, etc., which is all well and good, but none of them helped her while she was alive. It was an open casket, and a single red rose was placed in her hand. She had a Barbie that was given to her by her father that she loved, and that was buried with her. Her gravestone has a plaque which says, "World, please watch over the children." On June 25th, 1996, Iwilda pleaded guilty to the second-degree murder of her daughter. She was sentenced to 15 years, at which point she would be eligible for parole. The judge criticized the welfare system, the child welfare system, stating, "We have not created procedures to do everything necessary to protect the young and vulnerable in this society. The system has failed to protect our babies, and don't tell me how much it costs. If anything is to become of this horrendous tragedy, then it will be that we give priorities to the babies." Even though she became eligible for parole in 2010, she is still in prison as of now. She was most recently denied parole in July of 2018, and her next hearing is in July 2020. She is at the maximum security Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women. As for Carlos, he was only sentenced to serve between 1.5 and 3 years in prison to run consecutive with the sentence he was already serving. And that was only because of one instance of abuse, which he repeatedly banged Elisa's head against a concrete wall, and her siblings witnessed it. So, there is one good thing that came about from all of this. Rudy Giuliani, he was mayor of New York at the time, he insisted upon an urgent review of the child welfare system in New York. And that inspired the creation of the Administration for Children's Services. And they basically make sure that cases don't fall through the cracks, like this one. It's called Elisa's Law. And it was signed into legislation on February 12th, 1996. Many people were in attendance who had notified authorities of the abuse when nothing was done. It is still in place today, and it exists to hold the Child Welfare Agency of New York City publicly accountable for its performance. As for her 5 siblings, they were raised in separate foster homes, and they all suffered severe psychological trauma from witnessing what had happened to Elisa. Whew. It's a rough one. But that's part of the problem. So clearly there's a spectrum of abuse. There's neglect, abuse, torture, but all forms can cause intense problems later in life, as evidenced by her siblings. The statistics surrounding child abuse are really hard to hear, but it's harder to realize that it's 2019 and these stories are still prevalent and still widespread in modern first world countries. And this needs to be talked about, and something needs to be done. These stats are jarring. I'm just going to read through some of them. I'll be posting my sources as well. But, yeah. Every day, approximately 5 children die in the US because of child abuse. 1 out of 3 girls and 1 out of 5 boys will be sexually abused before they reach age 18. I have a little bit of a story about that too. I was not sexually abused, but I have a special needs cousin who has, he's in his 30s, but he has the mental capacity of a child. And it never affected me. I always knew it because he didn't know any better, but when I was a child, he pulled his pants down and made me touch his penis. So that was technically sexual abuse, obviously. It could have been much worse, obviously, but I guess count me in that 1 in 3. And that, that never really had an effect on me, but, it happened. I was just always pretty self-aware. All right. 70% of the children that die in the U.S. because of child abuse are under the age of 3. Boys and girls are actually victims at nearly the same rate. A report of child abuse is made every 10 seconds. In 2014, state agencies found an estimated 702,000 victims of child maltreatment, and that would pack 10 football stadiums. Individuals who reported 6 or more adverse childhood experiences had an average life expectancy 2 decades shorter than those who reported none. This is because ischemic heart disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, liver disease, and other health-related quality of life issues are tied to child abuse. A lot of that has to do with the mental health disorders, addictions, and related issues that have to do with that. Risk for intimate partner violence, alcoholism and alcohol abuse, illicit drug abuse, smoking and drinking at an early age, depression, and suicide attempts. That's not even talking about the sexual and reproductive health issues. They're more likely to have multiple sexual partners, more likely to have sexually transmitted diseases, unintended pregnancies, early initiation of sexual activity, and adolescent pregnancy and fetal death. In one study, 80% of 21-year-olds who had undergone abuse met the criteria for at least one psychological disorder. It's not all health problems either. For new cases in 2008 alone, lifetime estimates of lost worker productivity, healthcare costs, special education costs, child welfare expenditures, and criminal justice expenditures added up to $124 billion. And that could have sent 1.7 million children to college. Children who experience child abuse and neglect are about 9 times more likely to become involved in criminal activity. So far, a lot of these stats have had to do with the United States, but some international statistics. 40 million children around the world are subject to abuse each year, and suicide is the 3rd leading cause of death among adolescents worldwide. In the U.S., every 10 seconds a child is abused or raped. Today, 6 children will commit suicide due to abuse. And an estimated 60% of child deaths caused by child abuse are not recorded as such on death certificates. Even in death, nobody will talk about it. I know this has been a rough one. It still counts as something that makes people uncomfortable, and it should. It makes me uncomfortable, and the whole point of this podcast is I don't get uncomfortable. I love talking about things that make people uncomfortable because I can, and so many people can't. This one was hard. This one really did a number on me. I'm not usually an emotional person, but I'm really trying to hold it back. I hope I've taught you a little bit of something. It's just absolutely horrific to me. We can do more. Right now, there's not a lot being done. April has been designated Child Abuse Prevention Month in the U.S., and that's been since 1983, so we can see how much good that's done. The federal government is providing funding through community-based grants for the prevention of child abuse and neglect, but resources are limited. A considerable number of traumatized, abused children do not gain access to protective child protection strategies. And that's, I have my sources for these quotes and stats as well. and I'll put them up.